What's happening? What's happening? What's happening, blues people? You are now tuning into another episode of Jack Dapper Blues Radio. And this one is particularly a very special interview, categorized under one of our series called Black Spirituals, Field Hollers, and Slave Seculars. Today I speak with soprano, Black spiritual vocalist and historian, researcher, author, and to my liking, I would say folklorist and ethnographer, but we'll allow her to explain these things and if she falls into all of these categories, which I think she does. That was her singing one of my favorite Black spirituals, Go Down Moses, Let My People Go. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
I had to give you a round of applause. Miss Randye Jones, how are you today?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm excited because I first of all, that last Let My People Go, when it went from your head voice to the top of your head voice, I'm sure, like myself, everybody got goosebumps.
Well, I think of mainly the power of the song and just let it take me where it goes.
I hear that. So let's talk about your journey, okay? Because I can sit here and give you a million compliments, which I'm sure you've heard a million times. But let's get your story, because you chose to focus on Black spirituals. You have a couple of books. You have The Art of the Negro Spiritual, and then there's another book that you have. So you want to sing Black spirituals. I believe I'm saying it correctly. So. What started you on this journey? Let's start there.
Well, I guess really from the very beginning, my home church is Missouri Synod Lutheran, but it's an all-Black church. So we had both the German hymns and Negro Spiritual and at the same time in those services. And so I would hear the choir singing, and I would have an opportunity, finally to sing myself, and just found such great joy in singing those spirituals. I attended undergraduate school at Bennett College, which is an HBCU, and was introduced to singing choral music. The concert songs, the spirituals, especially of Nathaniel Dett, who was a teacher there a number of decades ago. And so that was just another thing that grabbed my interest. And then I finally decided I was going to do some graduate study, and I really wanted to sing. So I had an opportunity to study with a voice teacher at A&T State University. And I think what surprised a lot of people is that the teacher who I studied with, she was primarily going to just work with me because I had taken several years between my undergraduate and graduate studies to get me back into performing shape. But this teacher was a white lady who had studied, she grew up with spirituals in her cultural background, but she also studied spirituals at Juilliard with her teacher. And so she wanted to make sure that all of her students had at least some exposure to spirituals, whether they actually did anything seriously with them or not. Well, she struck a chord with me big time. And so I have, as each year, I've tried to learn a little bit more, tried to add to my repertoire, tried to find not only the standard songs such as the Burley, Hall Johnson, etc., but also find rare gems, songs that are just beautiful, but that are not as well known.
Right.
So that's where I'm going right now, is looking for those rare gems. Then also, one of the other things I had discovered was it was so hard, at least for me anyway, to find recordings of spirituals performed by concert performers who could help me get a deeper understanding of how to marry the technical skills a vocalist has to develop along with the folk music and to make that marriage work well together.
Right.
So that I could sing the spiritual in a manner that the spirituals need to be sung with the power, the depth of feeling, but yet still be able to communicate them as a singer is supposed to be able to do. So I was really, since unfortunately a lot of my voice teachers, other than the one I mentioned earlier, really didn't have the background in concert spirituals to be able to give me that extra technical and interpretive knowledge. So I really did end up relying a great deal on recordings and whatever research I could find. But the thing I think that I got from that was also a real desire to make it easier for other people to find those materials, those resources, and to be able to connect and network with others who were also making those efforts. So that's where the research became part of the book. So you want to sing spiritual.
Okay. So in that research, let me ask you this, and I like asking concert spiritual singers this. Is there a difference between the hymnal spirituals and what could be constituted as the cultured black backwood hoot and holler in spirituals?
I tend to categorize, I guess, and maybe that's not something I should do, but I do tend to do it. The hymnal, very honestly, it seems to me sometimes that when I see a spiritual in a hymnal, that an effort was made to fit the spiritual into the context of a hymn. And I've not really found many successful efforts to make that transition to something that's sitting in a hymnal that somebody's playing in a congregation is trying to sing, especially one that's not familiar with that,
right.
With the spirituals. Concert spirituals, there are people who argue that the folk spirituals are sing those old time, and you have Hollers spirituals. There are those who argue that the concert spiritual is a step outside of that, that they too take away some of the authenticity of the spiritual. I understand that. And so then it actually puts more of makes it more important even so to me to try to communicate when I'm singing concert spirituals as much of that history of the nature of the original spiritual as I can when I'm singing. I don't think it excuses me in any way that I'm not singing folk spiritual. I think it puts even more responsibility on me to sing them in that concert environment.
I definitely understand what you're saying. Would you consider some of Mahalia Jackson's performances and Paul Robeson performances concert spirituals rather than folk spirituals? Or is that kind of a difficult?
Well, no, because we're talking about two different things.
Okay.
Paul Robeson was singing in a concert style, even though he did not train vocally, the technique. He came. I don't know. His was such a natural capability as a singer. But unfortunately, most of us need to have the training to be able to do those things as a classically trained singer. But what he was doing was a very clearly concert spiritual. He was singing primarily Lawrence Brown composition. He was singing Burley, Paul Johnson. And so these were very definitely concert spirituals. But Mahalia Jackson, I think she was probably coming more from the improvisational tradition, where, you know a basic melody, but then you as a singer, as a musician, have more license to improvise. And thus the sound is different because what you're doing is not quite as structured as the concert spirituals can tend to be.
I dig it.
But I still would not say that she's necessarily singing folk spirituals. That I don't know. I honestly don't want to say one way or the other because I would probably start more debates than I would resolve. But I really think of them as doing two different things, but still not the traditional spiritual. The folk spiritual was a congregational, was a group interaction.
Like
sometimes with a leader, call and response. And that's not what she was doing either.
So wait, let's stop here and break this down. Right, because now, no. Because see, there are different nuances that should be expressed. Because now, you utilizing all three of yourself, Paul Robeson, and Mahalia Jackson, and understanding that there's a concert spiritual and a folk spiritual. The style of how it's saying vernaculars used is not necessarily what constitutes the separation. What constitutes the separation, what I'm hearing from what you just said, this is a question, not a statement. Are you saying what constitutes the separation between concert and folk is the ability to have the audience or other people interacting with you in that song, where the concert spiritual is more of a passive listening experience. Is this what we're saying?
I do believe it is more passive, yes, as far as audience engagement.
Right, that's what I mean, yes.
Right, because, yes, in the concert situation, you are the solo performer and your congregation is listening. They're not participating as far as singing per se. And so, I guess if you really wanted to get down to it, that's really what it could come down to, is what is the level of engagement between the performer and the congregation. I don't want to say audience in this case.
Right.
But so I think if you really wanted to just break it down to one or the other, and that's still not complete. That's one of the things I think I've gotten so much joy out of this exploration, is that I don't know that I will ever be completely, I will ever learn everything about the subject, because it's just, I keep finding nuances and reinterpretations of the history of the music, and how it was formed, and But I would say, really, as far as folk spiritual is concerned, that was engaged everybody. You know, everybody sang "Go Down, Moses." You'd have a leader who was started and let my people go. Everybody was part of that. And yeah, I think you could certainly take that as a way of separating a concert presentation of a spiritual and a presentation or folk engagement in the singing of spiritual.
So, with that being said, because that was a setup question, to ask you about the art of the Negro spiritual. And the reason why I said that was a setup question to there, because that's a very, to me, interesting name and look at it. I agree, but, you know, when you do research on the Negro spiritual and you come across... I can't think of all the German musicologists from the 1800s and the early 1900s that really didn't have positive things to say about this music. They pretty much said it was a knockoff of European music. Then you have the James H. Cones, who and the Wesley Works and people like this, who give a obviously the opposite definition of what it is, and these are real technical statements on both sides, real folky meaning, the reflection of the people. But when you say the art of the Negro spiritual, that kind of takes it out of a revolutionary. I don't want to say take it out. Let me rephrase that. We're focusing on another aspect of the form, right? Now it's presented as an art form rather than a response to society and all these other different things. What was your thought process in the art of the Negro spiritual, and what would you like or what did you intend for your audience or readers to receive from this site and book and documents?
Well, my desire, what I was hoping for, my goal, as it were, for the art of the Negro spiritual and everything that I've done in connection to it, was to look at the idea of singing spiritual in a concert environment, and then trying to gather information about what the music was. What is it about this music that makes it distinctive? What is its place in musical history? What composers helped that music develop? What is its difference between the original form of the spiritual and its concert styles now? What music have it influenced? Because, of course, the spiritual is root music for much of the American music as it exists now.
Absolutely.
And then what musics have influenced concert style over the decades? Because you can hear how jazz has influenced the composition of concert spirituals, how blues have influenced the concert styles of music, how European music has certainly influenced the creation of concert compositions, et cetera, and on and on. It's and then as a musician, having to make a decision about what style of presentation of that particular spiritual do I feel I can communicate most effectively. There are spirituals that are neo-romantic, that are certainly the early composers such as Burley and Hall Johnson and R. Nathaniel Dett, Florence Price, who are pioneers, and to me, I think are most influenced by the music as it was originally created by the originators of the spiritual. They were that generation that came right after the end of the Civil War, and so they were tapping directly in to that source, and they knew that music. I have tended to be very comfortable singing that style and that music from that era. And then anything that's more contemporary, I look at it very carefully as to what I think works for me.
Right.
But what I've tried to do with Art of the Negro Spiritual is to make all of those resources known, so that another singer who's coming along who maybe really is more stylistically inclined to say a Barbara Hendricks, where she's very clearly influenced by gospel music, and you hear that in her performance. Or someone who really likes more of a music that intertwines spirituals that with other styles, some of which I kind of wonder about, honestly. I think they get so far away from being spiritual, from the original sound of the spiritual, that is, for me, hard to identify them as spiritual. But that's my take.
Right.
When I look at the Art of the Negro Spiritual, I try to take as broad a view as possible, and to minimize my own perspective. I just want to try to get the information out there so that people are aware of what's there, what music scores are out there, what recordings are out there, what research is available, what authors are talking about the spiritual. And I try to also look at it not only from those of us who have had the opportunity, the advantage of coming from a culture that is exposed to the spiritual in its original form, and knows the history and understands where that's coming from, and so that people who don't have that advantage still are not closed out from having the opportunity to explore it.
All right. So, because it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, because that was a question I was going to ask, but I believe you answered it when you was explaining this. You favor, or you express the early Fisk Jubilee version of the 1840s, 1860s black spirituals. Is that your particular lane? Well, that's question one. And question two, you mentioned spirituals, you mentioned gospel, and you also mentioned that there are those that could be considered influenced by the two, but it doesn't particularly, for your taste, perspective, fall into what could be considered black spirituals, Negro spirituals. So I'm going to ask you to break down, after you answer the first question, the difference between black spirituals, gospel, field hollers, please.
Okay. Oh dear, I'm sorry. You remind me of the first time that someone asked me to explain the difference between Negro spirituals and gospel music. And I found myself at a loss because I couldn't, within what I thought I needed to was like a 1-minute explanation of the difference between the two, and really explain them successfully. Ended up writing a paper about it because I said like, oh no, we got to have a better sense of what we're doing here. But to me, the difference is, first of all, historic. The Negro spiritual came from slavery. It was directly created during the antebellum, the slavery era of the 19th century United States. these are songs that we do not know who the creators are. I'm trying not to use the word composer because that implies something that I don't want to imply. But who were the creators of these songs? These were songs that were created extemporaneously. Someone would start a song that expressed the situation at that moment. Sometimes they were influenced by the hymns or whatever that they might have heard when they attended the services that their masters expected them to attend, and they would sometimes take that, turn it completely around into something that was that they wanted to sing. But and then there were times when they would just completely create their own song. They would sing it. The group would get it, learn it. They might adapt it, change it, and then by the time they're done with it, it gets communicated elsewhere, and it just expands out from there. This is folk music. We do not know who the creators are. And unfortunately, we had to, because this was an oral tradition, we had to rely on others to set it down. That was the way that ended up being preserved. Gospel music, and it's also, I guess one other thing, as far as you have the sorrow songs that that talk about the pain of the moment. People whose children were sold out away from them, who were separated from one another, or whose day-to-day struggles they needed to express that somehow. Gospel music, on the other end, is a child, of the spiritual. It began to develop from basically from the gospel hymns that came from post-Civil War era, where people had decided that the songs of slavery were no longer the songs they wanted to sing. They wanted to get away from slavery. They wanted to get away from everything that reminded them of slavery. And they began creating new songs. There were people who, in the church, they basically, like my tradition where I was raised in Missouri Synod Lutheran, there were Methodist churches and Catholic churches and other Protestant and or churches that created churches for African Americans who were now ex-slaves. And they wanted to try to bring them into their denomination. Their songs didn't quite match up with the songs that came from the spirituals. Right. And so some churches adapted, some churches let them go completely. And then we get into basically the creation of what is now known as as Black gospel music.
Right.
And Precious Lord, Take My Hand. And from that point on, you start getting into by Thomas A. Dorsey, and who is considered the father of Black gospel music. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. He was intentional in setting these songs down, making sure that the composer, and I use this term now very, very intentionally, he made sure that the composers were credited for these works. He went around from church to church, introduced this music, brought new singers in, introduced the idea of using instrumentation that they would have never had the opportunity to use in the camp meetings and so forth of the spiritual. And, then you start hearing recordings and, we could spend an entire hour talking about the difference between gospel music and spiritual.
Absolutely.
But what it comes down to is just that gospel music is good news that is a contemporary, much more contemporary sound whereas spirituals are in their original form folk music that is primarily of the 19th century.
Okay, so I get that as well, and I'm happy you brought up sorrow songs, because now we can, I guess, discuss if you will, these different compartments of I lump all of these into African American traditional music, right? And or you could say tribal music for that matter, and you have the black spiritual, you have the slave secular, you have the sorrow song and the field holler, right? And then all these things kind of like branches off. In this branch off, because you mentioned we get to a period where the black community is like, we don't want to remember or represent anything that expresses slavery or bondage or prisoners of war, however you want to word it. So they kind of evolved the music. Where, to you, in your studies, blues and Negro spirituals, which is not far removed from each other, as we know, where does that split and overlapping come in, if you are willing to take the risk and answer this one?
I'm not sure I'm terribly comfortable getting too much into discussion of blues, simply because that's just not an area that I've chosen to study extensively.
Okay.
And so I think I would probably find myself very quickly in water much deeper than I could swim in.
Understood.
But the blues tradition certainly is another child of the spiritual, just as jazz and reggaeton and rock and R&B and so forth and so on. They all connect back. I think that's where I'm just going to leave that, okay?
No, I understand. So, okay. Let's talk about church types. Because you mentioned the Lutheran church, you mentioned the German, I think Lutheran, you mentioned the different missionaries and how different congregations incorporated or brought in these newly freed blacks, and in some cases still enslaved. So now we have different denomination traditions that are evident in the music, or at least in the sound of the music traditionally. Would you say that is based on which one is, I guess, more black, and then which one is more influenced by non-blacks? Is that where that comes in?
I don't know. I really don't know. I would imagine, though, that certainly I would think it would really be more a matter of the makeup of the congregation and what their specific congregational choices were. As I said, my home church, it was an all-black church. We tended to mix. So, you could start your service and have the traditional Lutheran liturgy, but the hymns that they selected, some of which would be from the Lutheran hymnal, and some would be from black tone. In fact, I remember we actually used to put together our own little separate hymnal that had gospel songs in it and spirituals and whatever from, and so I think that's more of an individual influence rather than necessarily denominational as a whole.
Okay. So that's all. So I'm almost asking you, based on your answer, does it feel like I'm asking you the difference between a mega church and a storefront almost?
That one, I'm afraid, is outside my. I would be guessing, and I'm really not sure about that.
Okay. Well, so let me ask you this, because there are traditional ways of vocal phrasing, right, of Negro spirituals, and you know they were utilized outside of the spirituals and gospel as well, right? We know that. We can think of Aretha Franklin, we could think of Ma Rainey, we could think of the non-black female singers of the late 1800s and the early 1900s who took part in what was known as coon shouting. Is there a, or how can I ask this? That's a better question. Is it a artistic decision on how one would choose to phrase their black spirituals when they're singing these songs, right? Because there's variations, right? There's more what people think more backward, then there's more what people think are more technical and things of this nature.
Well, if I understand your question correctly, and you can tell me if I don't, please. I'm going to give you an example using a song that actually isn't the spiritual.
Okay.
But I'm going to try to explain at least my understanding. The song is "Amazing Grace," which is actually a song that was written by a white ex-slaver. But it is stylistically performed as it was originally composed, which is pretty much in for want of a better term, and more of a hymn style, which would be just basically "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound," et cetera, et cetera. Then you have someone who might take that same song and sing it more in the style of what I would think of when I'm singing spiritual, which is more like "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." Or, and I'm not a gospel singer, so please forgive me if I don't do this correctly, but gospel, to my ear, tends to take even more liberty with the melismas, the ornamentation, and you could really do some things with it that I, as a concert singer, would be less inclined to want to do. But say that same "Amazing Grace," amazing grace, how sweet the sound. So you have totally different approaches to exactly the same song. And that's an interpretive decision. But it's the difference between, and I think it's part of the confusion why a song like "Amazing Grace" gets categorized as a gospel song or as a spiritual, because the person that's familiar with that song probably heard it as a spiritual and thought that's what it was. Or they heard it in a gospel style and they thought that's what it was. So that's really, that you now get into an issue of, has a song been categorized based on how it's being sung?
Oh, so first and foremost, that was a great explanation and breakdown. Okay, so it made it very clear, and I would imagine, and I hope for the audience as well, it made it clear for me. But one thing that I do want to ask, because now, see, because what I received is the spiritual is more technically astute, I guess it would be the word, and then the gospel is where those liberties of what's considered black cultural music phrases come in, and not the other way around.
I think it depends on, in this case, as I said, what the singer chooses to do. I have heard concert performers take composition where the composer intended for them to heavily ornament that song. But they used a spiritual, the spiritual tradition, and turned the stylistic interpretation into something closer to gospel.
Okay, no, I get it. So that okay. So
I guess let me go back to what I think was your original question, because I'm not sure I answered it, and maybe now I could try.
You did, but not only did you answer it, you did what you said. You actually prophesized where this conversation was going to go, because not only did you answer my question, you raised another question. Didn't you say you was going to raise?
Okay.
Because for me, and this could explain a lot of the confusion, as you said. I would imagine, based on black spirituals coming out of the bush meetings or these ritualistic tribal celebratory worships, this is where what you just expressed, the gospel side of it comes in. But you're saying it wasn't black spirituals. That was more, how can I say, formal. That's a good word. The black spiritual is more formal, where the gospel is really where the down-home vernacular phrases comes in. Is this what you're sharing?
No, that's not what I'm sharing. We're talking about, What I was talking about was the interpretation of a spiritual, basically more in a concert style.
Okay.
Because you asked we've been talking about the art of Negro Spiritual.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
And it's since you're also talking about, I think, when you're talking about group performance, I think that individuals contribute their part of singing of that spiritual, but there's still, I think there is some structure there so that everybody can be together in a certain respect. Whereas when you're singing gospel, if you're singing in a choral style, everybody's still singing basically. Is still singing a basically structured. Everybody knows what their part is going to be. It's when you start dealing with the individual singing gospel, who then has the flexibility to interpret and has as many options as they are, their voices are able to handle. That they, whatever. They want to do as far as ornamentation. When you are when you're singing concert spirituals, you have as many options as you want to take. The thing is, how far away do you get away from the singing of that spiritual, and how much of it takes away from the communication of the words and the meaning of that spiritual? When you start getting into, how flowery can I make this song? Are you now, as a performer, changing it from being an interpreter of the song to being an interpreter of a musical technical presentation.
Understood.
And I guess one of the terms I've tended to use is an academic study.
Mm.
And you can, when you're singing a spiritual, to me, if you're just singing the spiritual and there's nothing, that is technically fine, but the words and the meaning of that song are absent, that to me is where you've gotten away from singing the spiritual.
Got you.
With gospel music, on the other end, I think you do have the flexibility. You have more of an opportunity because of the way that the gospel music may be stylistically inclined, to have freedom to do the melismas and the ornaments that you've got more, that you can choose to whatever you think your voice is capable of doing, and whatever you think your audience is going to move your audience.
Right.
And that using that style of music. And at that point, then we're talking about, okay, I'm singing in spiritual in a gospel style.
Mm.
And if that's what I choose to do, and I think I can pull it off, more power to me.
Right.
There are some who would say that singing, for example, "Precious Lord," which is one of the few gospel pieces I will sing, because I just don't think stylistically I can sing gospel music and make it sound like I'm a gospel singer.
Mm-hmm.
I can choose to sing that straight.
Mm-hmm.
I can choose to add a light amount of ornamentation to it, or a light amount of improvisation to it, or I can go for it. I just really get out there with it.
Right.
And I think part of that for me is influenced by, first of all, how much do I think I can get away with and sing it. I don't want to use the word effectively, but that to me is the word coming across right now.
Right.
That makes it sound like I'm really trying to share the good news.
Right.
And a lot of that can be, for me, is influenced by who I'm singing to.
Mm.
If I'm in a church where I know they really are more oriented towards the gospel style of music, I'm going to be more inclined to do that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If I go into a church where I know they have no idea what the world I'm doing when I do that, I'm more than likely I'm going to sing that song with a lot less ornamentation, and pretty much sing it more straight than I would or otherwise. So I think you could, I don't know if I'm really answering your question. I hope I am, but
no, you
are. That's really where you have to, as the presenter of that music, make decisions about where you want to go or should go with it.
Understood. I do understand, and we So with that being said, we're also keeping in mind, this is a question, not a statement, that we're still dealing in the realm of the difference between the concert singer and the folk singer, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And all right. So all right. Okay. So now let's.
So now let me give you one other example, and maybe and I'm hoping that this back in the 1960s, the beginning of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and this is something that people don't necessarily know heavily about, but they see the impact of it. Mm-hmm. When they first started marching, there were people who started coming down from the north who were helping out as participants in the marches. It was thought that they wanted something to connect people together. People who were very, very different. Southern marchers, the Southern folk who really didn't know anything about the North, people who were coming down from the North who knew nothing about folks who lived in the South. And what they chose to do was to use music. Of course, everybody, We Shall Overcome, of course, is a hymn that comes into, that basically became the theme of the civil rights movement. But they also used a lot of spirituals, like Wade in the Water.
Right.
And they would change the words from their original text to using words that were related to the protests that were marches that were going on, or that they were in jail. They would sing songs that talked about where they were and what they were experiencing at that moment. That was using the folk spiritual in a way that extended basically the history of that song, of those songs. Yet his wife gave concerts, raised money, singing concert styles of because she actually studied at New England Conservatory, was studying to be a classically trained musician.
Are we talking about Colorado?
Yeah.
I did not know, and I thought I knew a lot.
She had her master's degree in performance.
Oh my goodness!
And that was how she raised money for the civil rights movement, was by giving concerts. And part of her concertizing included concert performance of spirituals.
That is a topic alone within itself, okay? Because now I'm wondering, why is he calling Mahalia Jackson when his woman sang? I'm sorry. Go ahead. Don't answer that question.
When you have no, I can't. Well, I mean, that doesn't mean that she wasn't singing to the too.
That's right.
But no, yeah, that was how a lot of their fundraising came from those type of programs. And if you want to find out, I did a bio on her, primarily her experience as a concert performer. And that's up on Art of the Negro Spiritual. So take a look when you got a chance.
Definitely.
But anyway, what I guess my point was that the spiritual has not only been part of the folk tradition as from the African American experience, but as part of as the concert aspect of it as well. So anyway.
No, I mean that's serious, and that's great to know, because now we're talking about something that, again, we mentioned there was a time when people wanted to get away from this, but then there's a time when it brought everybody together for the cause. I want to talk briefly about your performances and lectures. So some of the things you're sharing with us right now, is this what you share in your lectures?
Yes. I have done lectures on what are spiritual. I try to tailor it to the audience. I talked about, must you be black to sing spiritual? And that really deals with what is the history? Why is there a concern about someone who is not African American singing spirituals? I talk about minstrelsy, about events that are even up to today where the spiritual, where and other black music has been mistreated,
and appropriated,
and then and misappropriated and appropriated, as you say, and then talk about on the other end, though, as a classically trained singer, I cannot walk into someone's school and say, I am a classically trained singer if I can't sing German lead or French melody. Why should I not then be able to turn around and say that I expect my students to have at least contact with, exposure to, a song in the American tradition of art song, the concert spiritual. At least to know what they are and to be able to recognize and to affirm some. I mean, whether you take it anywhere or not, but I think it's a way to be able to introduce people to the culture, to the history, to what those songs mean, and to do it in a way that the boy student would be able to understand because it connected to their other experiences as musicians.
No, I hear that. That's deep.
I don't. For me personally, I don't generally concertize anymore singing German lead, but I know the musical style, as I'm expected to know it.
Right.
And it ties into all my other knowledge of music as a whole. I think a well-rounded musician should not only know the European tradition, they should also know American traditions, including the Negro Spiritual.
Well, let me ask you a question, because when you say including the Negro Spiritual, I'm of the belief that the American tradition of music is pretty much black music, period. So do you believe that or no?
I believe that the American music is influenced heavily by two traditions, European and African. And African, when I say African, I mean as far as the spiritual and other music that has come from that tradition. American music, that's basically where it is. And so when I say that, I'm talking about not only music that has been influenced by European music styles, but also those that have been influenced by the African traditions, especially the music that has been rooted from that, the spiritual. Popular music, rock and roll, etc., would not exist had it not been for the spiritual. I don't know what they would be singing, but they certainly would not be singing rock and roll.
So I want to, with that being said, let's bring it current, if you don't mind discussing this, because I saw a very disturbing post that you shared, and considering right now in 2020, we're not only experiencing a pandemic, but we're also experiencing civil unrest and people protesting and fighting about injustices perpetrated still and currently to the African American citizens, black citizens, Native citizens. Do you want to discuss that incident and how, with all this going on, this actually still happened?
How that still happened?
In regards that there's still people saying this, using that word, the N word.
Yeah. Well, let's just say right now I'm feeling kind of touchy about that because I just had my own personal experience with that. within the last week. I will simply say that I don't think that I think that there are people who are unaware or who do not wish to acknowledge, whether they are aware of it or not, just how much the American culture is dependent upon, influenced by Africanism, Africanness, the Black experience, as it were. And if they ever sat down and they were ever given a primer of just how much of their lives are influenced, have been influenced. If nothing else, they just sat down with Ken Burns' gospel music video. I'm sorry, not gospel music. I'm sorry, that was incorrect. Country music history.
Right.
And he spends time talking about how much of country music was influenced by African Americans.
That's right.
There is no American culture without that Black experience touching it in some way or another. There just isn't. And I think that there are those who, I was trying to remember something I read recently where they said that there were people who had started doing these DNA tests and how they were shocked to find out that they had Black blood. And I'm thinking, really? You're shocked?
Right.
I mean, seriously? Think about that for a minute. Hey. And so, I think that there's going to be, or there's occurring maybe even now, an acknowledgement of just how deeply a part of the African, and I keep saying African, but I mean the Black experience. How deeply a part of America it is. Mm. It just, and when folks realize that, I think it's going to be an eye-opening and maybe freeing experience for them. That I enjoy this. This is part of me as an American.
Right.
And that's I have been influenced whether I knew it or not.
So, 50. I'm asking everybody this as of recent, regardless to what I'm interviewing them about. 50 years from now, someone hears this interview. What would you like them to take away from your works?
I would like for them to take away the idea that we, as a people, have created so much. Some of it has been lost to history. Some of it has faded and as time has passed, but it's always there. And it serves as a foundation that we can grow from, that we can develop from.
Is this Black people or just people in general?
I mean, just people in general. That we as a people, as human beings, whatever our race or color or background, have so much that we can draw upon, that we can use and to help us develop as human beings and to help us understand one another. And so I guess when I'm trying to do the art of the Negro Spiritual, when I published this book, So You Want to Sing Spiritual, I really wanted folks as a whole to be able to have something that they could say, yes, I'm curious. I want to understand. And if this can help me make deepen that understanding even a little bit, then I've accomplished something.
Very groovy. Now, I'm going to place this in the description, but I still would like you to tell the listeners your Twitter, Facebook handles, and all social media things they can find you and reach you on.
My primary page is randyejones.com, and I spell Randye with an E, so it's RandyeJones.com. There are also several other websites that reflect my research. Afrocentric Voices, which is one of the first, if not the first, site that was on the internet that actually dealt with African American vocal music from a classical music standpoint. Art of the Negro Spiritual.com is my primary site that connects all of my research on concert spiritual. And then one of the sites that I want to mention, which is a database that addresses recordings of concert spiritual for solo vocal. I'm hoping that somebody's going to get the idea of taking that from a choral music standpoint, but it is surprisingly such a large field that I really wanted to focus on solo vocal. But it's spirituals-database.com. And you can find out information about very well-known performers such as Marian Anderson, Leontine Price, Paul Robeson, to people who had only a single recording, maybe, or who are no longer really well known, although they may have been back in the early days of recording. And that is actually a development towards my next book, which I'm hoping will be out within the next, not too far down the road.
Okay.
That deals specifically on the question of recordings of concert spirituals. Those sites generally give you most of what I would have access. As far as Facebook, you can very easily, I think, find me just searching for my name. And I'm on Twitter, but Twitter I'm not very active on. So I don't know. I guess I think a certain somebody who's currently occupying the White House kind of turned me off on Twitter. So I don't use it very often, but I do have a Twitter handle, Singing One. So that you can give it a shot, but I think your best bet is to try to reach me through Facebook.
Groovy, dig it, and we are with it. I am so honored and happy that you took the time to rap with us. I want to, if I may, end this episode with a song by you. I don't know if you hear it coming up, but I want to thank you first.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Do you know a Derek McQueen, by the way?
I've enjoyed talking with you. I'm sorry?
Do you know a Derek McQueen?
I know of him.
I'm going to try to introduce you to. I love the both of you. You guys really, historically, performance-wise, and everything in between, is very necessary what you all do, and I enjoy speaking with you too.
Well, you have a good day.
You too.